Welcome to week 10, lecture 19, which is on fiscal deficits and government debt. The prescribed reading is Stiglitz and Rosengard, chapter 28. So what this lecture covers is the US deficit problem since the 1980s, the sources of the deficit problem, so why is the United States in a deficit? What have been successes in taming the deficit? In other words, this is related to the expenditure of the 1990s. And what are the consequences of government deficits? So now we are transitioning into macroeconomics. Firstly, how does a deficit arise? Well, what happens is that a government charges taxes and then it spends money on different types of projects. In other words, that is referred to the charging of taxes, and the spending of monies received from taxes, that is referred to as fiscal policy. Now, if the taxes are lower than expenditures, what we have is we have a so-called fiscal deficit. And what happened in the United States is that the deficit ballooned, or at least increased, and this is a problem then that is of interest to many economists and also politicians and political analysts. And by the 1992 presidential election, public opinions were persistently ranking huge deficits among the central problems facing the government. And specifically facing the countries, given that the government runs the country. That is the US. What happened was that these deficits resulted in increasing debt, and if you need to spend, you need to borrow money if you don't have it from taxes, so that's why debt arises, and you also need to service that debt, so that is why deficits lead to debt, because that money needs to come from somewhere. In other words, if taxes are not paying for that expenditure, we need to borrow, and that is where deficits come from. And hence, what happens is that there is a burden upon the government to pay interest on the debt that it has. And it was viewed that these higher deficits threatened the long-term well-being of the economy. So let us take a look. So what is it that has started happening? As you can see, in terms of current dollars, in other words, not adjusted for changes in prices, what we see is what appears to be a massive deficit from the early 2000s, but also at least there is a short period of time when there was a surplus. But as you can see, that deficit develops in the 1980s, remains more or less constant around $200 billion. Then there is a brief recovery. In this point, we go into a surplus, or in other words, the US goes into a surplus. But then again, what we have is we have a decline and an increase in the deficit. If we adjust for prices, in other words, we talk about dollars in prices as they would have been in 2005, that is a so-called real deficit. Again, as you can see, that deficit persists from the 80s to the early 2000s or late 90s. There is also a brief recovery and again an increase in the deficit. And of course, the two graphs are related. In the one instance, we are talking about a nominal deficit, so we're not adjusting for prices. And here, what we are doing is we are adjusting for prices. That is why we talk about so-called constant dollars. Now, what is the source of the deficit? Well, in the 80s, what happened is that taxes were cut. As you can imagine, the amount of tax that is charged is also a political issue. But that tax is needed to fund spending. And if there isn't enough tax revenue, well, that is why we have a deficit. So it seems to be a catch-22 situation. So what happened was that the real deficit peaked in 1992 at $390 billion. Then there was a bit of a recovery. And then what we have is we have a deficit increasing. So deficits recurred beginning of the 2000s, peaking at 10% of GDP. This is where we are at. In 2009, in the middle of the Great Recession. Well, as you can imagine, government programs are set years before, but taxes are received on a monthly basis. Of course, this means that if we are assuming that a situation doesn't change and we keep the same level of spending, but in fact the situation did change due to a Great Recession. In other words, there was an economic crisis, which means fewer taxes. What we have is we have a ballooning deficit. So going into more detail, what we see here is how does the US budget, or specifically budgets and surplus for the US, compare to numerous other countries. Well, as you can see, Norway is running a surplus throughout the 2000s, specifically the early 2000s, whereas the situation for the United Kingdom, the United States, and South Africa is deteriorating. Countries such as Chile have a bit of a deficit, so they do not seem to be in trouble. And then what we also have Korea, who runs a more or less balanced budget. In other words, it is not heavily in a surplus or a deficit. So what has happened is that most countries saw the deficits rise or surpluses shrink over time. And it happens that the US has a bigger deficit than many other countries in terms of as a percentage of GDP. The only other country is Greece. So what are the sources of the deficit problem? Well, first of all, what we have to look at is what happened before the 1970s and then in the 1980s in order to drive this deficit. Well, there's six reasons that are suggested. First of all, there was a reduction in federal taxes over time, that is. In other words, there were certain events and certain legislation that resulted in lower taxes. So there were tax cuts that we enacted in the Reagan presidency, and these pushed the federal tax take down. In other words, federal revenues, tax revenues fell due to these cuts that were enacted. Then in 2001 and 2003, there were tax cuts that further reduced the federal tax take. And then what we had was the Great Recession in 2008 and starting 2008, but peaking 2009, 2010. And what happened is that federal tax revenue as a share of GDP dropped below 15% in 2009 and 2010 as a result. And this was the lowest percentage since the 1950s. Well, what happens in a recession? People don't have money. People lose jobs, so less taxes are paid. And this is the result that we see. So this deficit can be attributed, well, at least one of the reasons, relates to tax cuts and also a recessionary period. Next, what we have is the issue of wars. Wars cost money. So there was high defense spending during certain periods of time. Specifically, federal defense expenditure fell during the 1970s as the Vietnam War came to an end. In other words, expenditure fell. So what we saw was a drop in defense expenditure from 9.4% of GDP to 4.7% of GDP in a matter of 10 years. However, in 1979, following the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan, President Carter called for a large defense buildup. So again, expenditure increased to 6% of GDP. So we go from this level to this level. So as you can imagine, government is again spending more. What happened in the late 90s? Well, the Cold War came to an end, and therefore defense spending was as low as 3% of GDP from 1999 to 2001. However, as you know, there were conflicts that took place starting in 2003, specifically in response to September 9/11 in 2001, which was a terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. And this resulted in a spike in defense expenditure, with defense expenditure reaching 4.8% in 2010. So note that is why we saw the US go into a surplus in the early 2000s and again go into a deficit. This is also what contributes. So that is why we see that recovery for a short period of time on those diagrams that we discussed in the previous two slides. What is quite interesting, that US defense spending is roughly equal to that of the rest of the world combined. So you can imagine what a power the United States is as a result of that. Furthermore, there's also been higher social security spending on the elderly. So the elderly population in the US has grown as it has grown in the rest of the world. And not only absolutely, but as a proportion of the population. In other words, not only are there more elderly people, there are also a bigger proportion of the population. And hence, what has happened is there's been an increase in federal expenditures on programs such as Social Security and Medicare. Just to give you a comparison, so these programs averaged 5% of GDP in the 1970s, but increased to over 6% of GDP by the 1980s. So expenditure rose over 10 years by about 1%, and then in a matter of 2 years, it rose by 1% again. In the recent years, these programs have risen to more than 8% of GDP and are expected to increase substantially over the next decades. Next, and perhaps related, what we see is an increase in healthcare expenditures. Through the Medicare and Medicaid program, the federal government alone pays 36% of all health expenditures. So there is a lot of money going into this. Healthcare expenditures themselves have soared. So through the 1980s and early 1990s, these expenditures increased to close to 12% a year, doubling every 6 years. So that is why we are seeing an increase in health expenditures. Of course, this is related to what we outlined on the previous slide. The previous reason, some of this can be related to an aging population. And some of these are also consequences of important innovations which improve the length and the quality of life. The real concern, which we covered in chapter 13, is that the US healthcare system is very inefficient and it doesn't deliver the outcomes of the same standard or to the same extent that are delivered in countries that spend less on healthcare. And we discussed the reasons for this. So the issue is one of efficiency, of an efficient healthcare system, something that the US does not appear to have. The fifth reason is high interest payments. So the federal government also pays interest. Now, if it borrows to finance its deficit, what happens? It has to pay interest on that debt. So during the 1970s, the federal net interest payments averaged 1.5% of GDP. But by the mid-1980s, the size of these interest payments exceeded 3% of GDP. And the main reason was increasing debt. So if the debt in 1995 had been the same as it had been at the start of the Reagan era, in other words, it increased from 1981, the government would have been running a balanced budget rather than a deficit of 160 billion. And here is the problem. Deficits through interest payments feed on themselves. Why? Well, government has less money to spend on social projects to finance its expenditures because of interest payments. So what does it do? It borrows more. And when it borrows more, it has to pay more debt. So it seems like a vicious circle. Then there has been an economic downturn. So tax revenues decrease when the economy goes into a downturn. Why? People are earning less and some people lose jobs, so less taxes are paid. At the same time, what we see is expenditures on unemployment benefits and welfare benefits and social insurance going up. So what you have is government expenditure on certain items going up, yet taxes falling. So as you can see, this is a recipe for a rising deficit. Many people cannot find jobs, including the elderly, during a recession. So what do? They start collecting Social Security. So how was the budget brought under control? Well, specifically, how was the budget deficit brought under control in the 90s? And this began around 1993. It wasn't easy, it was difficult, but there was some success in achieving this. Well, first of all, what we need to do is look at the composition of government expenditures. So the budget has a specific composition. So as you can see, there are a number of major elements, and a large portion is devoted to defense uh, entitlement programs and interest payments. So here we have defense, here we have the entitlement programs, that piece of the pie, and then what we have is we have net interest payments. So what had to happen is that cuts had to be made in some areas, or at least some of these categories of the budgets. And the reason why is because making cuts in other areas simply would not have an impact, because these areas are so small. Going back to entitlement programs, what are these programs? Well, these are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, income security, and veteran benefits. And here what the government does, it defines eligibility criteria for certain benefits, and that is why we call these benefits so-called entitlements, and then it links to this idea of these being entitlement programs. The issue that we have is then that these actual expenditures depend upon how many people meet criteria and the cost of these benefits. The further issue that arises is that government does not on an annual basis control expenditures. What it can do is it can change expenditure levels by changing the criteria for eligibility or the level of benefits. And obviously this takes time, and then we don't know how many people are going to apply for these benefits. So hence that is why you have some variability in spending. What you do also have is, in contrast to these entitlement programs, what you have is discretionary programs. So here what the government does, it sets annual expenditure levels for these programs, unlike the entitlement programs, which have a degree of variability. So the problem with entitlement programs is, as I've already mentioned, or the existence of these programs is that the government does not have control of 2/3 of its expenditures, because these are entitlements. So, for example, somebody might get sick one year and hence need money or approach one of these programs or rely on one of these programs, but not the next year. So there is no guarantee as to what the expenditure will be. Then, of what remains aside from these entitlement programs, 2/3 goes on to defense, and this leaves 12% of the budget in the non-defense discretionary category. Going back to the issue of taxes, remember that one of the issues that arose was that the budget deficit is too high in the United States. So this is something that the public started caring about. Yet Ronald Reagan promised that taxes would not be raised, and also promised not to cut Social Security. So hence, if you have expenditures on Social Security, but taxes are not rising quickly enough, you have a deficit. So simply there is insufficient scope for cutting other expenditures to bring the budget back into balance. Hence, there were other factors that came into play that tamed the deficit in the 90s, temporarily at least. First of all, there was an increased income tax on high income individuals. Also, there was a limit on the growth of expenditures, or a limiting of the growth of expenditures, and also a strong economy. And a strong economy means higher tax revenues. Each of these factors is estimated to have contributed about 1/3 of the overall deficit reduction. Recall that what is tied to the deficit is this need to pay interest if government is funding its expenditure through borrowing, which it has to do if expenditure exceeds taxation. So think about it this way. Well, what happens if government has to borrow? Well, what we have is we have the demand curve for funds shifting rightward. Now that rightward shift results in a higher interest payment that is required. But high interest rates mean that there is less investment because firms also borrow, right? How do firms invest? Well, one way to fund the investment is through debt. Now, if interest is rising due to government borrowing money, what happens is investment is crowded out. Why? Due to a higher interest rate. So this is again a bit of a vicious circle. What we see is less investment and less economic growth, and government has to then pay more interest and receives less revenues, or revenues don't increase as quickly due to lower economic growth. And because of government borrowing, ultimately what happens is we crowd out private investment. So what has worked in taming the budget deficit? Well, in 1993, when President Clinton assumed office, the economy was still in downturn. That is the US economy. And there was a feeling that the actions to tame the deficit immediately would make matters worse. What this meant is that there had to be great care that was taken in the timing of expenditure cuts. Why does this matter? Well, when there is a recession, you don't want to cut back on government spending. Why? Because government spending is what funds programs which employ people. So, for example, government undertakes infrastructure projects. Somebody needs to carry out these infrastructure projects. So during a recession, one way for government to alleviate the effects is to spend more. So you don't want to cut back during a recession, but you're receiving less taxes. Again, a bit of a problem. Also, there was concern that if the deficit were cut in the wrong way, not only could poverty increase, but the long-term growth could also be negatively impacted. And this would be counterproductive even to the ultimate goal of deficit reduction. Moreover, the Clinton administration's objective was to redirect more public expenditures towards investment and increase effectiveness of the public expenditures by spending more money on programs that had shown higher returns. So the idea is this: sometimes you might spend on something that does not offer returns. So for example, you build a stadium, you spend a lot of money on that. Yes, in the short run what happens is people are employed, but in the long run it becomes a white elephant. In other words, it's just there and doesn't really carry on generating returns after the events that it's been constructed for, let's say such as the World Cup, have passed. On the other hand, let's say that you spend money on education, you build another university. Well, this is a long-term investment. This continues to yield returns. So where money is spent matters on what it is spent. So it's not only about spending money, but where it is being spent. So by 1993, there was a real concern that the economy's infrastructure, such as roads and airports. And during the previous 12 years, public expenditures on infrastructure as percentage of GDP had sunk to half of what they were in the late 1960s. So as you can see, there was a drop in the expenditure on infrastructure. Now, infrastructure matters for growth. So the idea is you want to drive growth. And we go back to this idea as to the nature of expenditure. So what the Clinton administration did is it made significant improvements in increasing public investment in education. And this was driven by concern about the size of the deficit and unwillingness to raise taxes. And there was little scope as a result for increasing investment. So hence investment and expenditure had to be carefully decided. So this is why one of the reasons we have this investment in one area. Furthermore, what the Clinton administration tried to do is it tried to stimulate the economy in the short run by making commitments to cut deficits in the long run, a commitment that it fulfilled. However, making such credible commitments is difficult, more so today than it was in the 90s. That is because back then there was scope for cutting discretionary government spending. In subsequent decades, this expenditure has been reduced except for military spending. So there was more scope in the 90s than now. The focus is then on entitlements, so cutting healthcare expenditures will force households to pay more, and as a result will result in de facto rationing of healthcare. So you see what the problem is of cutting back on certain programs to tame the deficit. So ultimately, an approach is to stimulate the economy in order to generate more taxes to cover the deficit, and that is the aim in the short run. And hopefully what this leads to is a drop in the deficit. But the problem is that cutting expenditure in some areas will have consequences. So what are the consequences of government deficit? So when a government runs a deficit, it must borrow to pay the difference between its expenditures and revenues. And this is what I've been saying through the previous slides, or narrating through the previous slides. And if it runs a deficit year after year, what happens is it has to borrow year after year. And the problem is that this accumulates debt, and this debt has to be paid off. So what we have is we have federal debt rising. And what we see is that the federal debt that was held in real dollars by the public over the last 70 years was at its highest in 2010. Also, it wasn't as high as it would have been as a percentage of GDP around the 40s during the time of World War II, but it also peaked in 2010. It is not the overall peak, it is a local peak. So it is not the global maximum, it is a local minimum. So debt has been rising, or federal debt has been rising as a percentage of GDP, which is of course reflected in its value in billions of dollars. And the seriousness of the situation can be seen in that it was equal to 63% of GDP in 2010. Moreover, the immediate consequence of rising federal debt is that government needs to pay more and more in terms of interest unless the interest rate declines. So this is one of the factors that contributes to a deficit. You borrow to fund your deficit and you pay more interest. So you have less money to spend. Hence, you borrow more, you pay more interest. So hence, there is a vicious circle that continues. So what economists have traditionally argued is that government borrowing, just like individual borrowing, may be justified relative to the purpose for which the money is used. So for example, if you borrow to buy a house that you will live in for many years, or a car that you will drive for many years, you are spreading out the payment for the item as you use it. But furthermore, what also matters is that, again, the investments that government makes by spending money on either infrastructure or some kind of government program results in a return in the long run. So ideally what government would want to do is it would want to promote economic growth through its expenditures, or invest in projects that promote economic growth over the long run, because this results in more people having jobs and paying higher levels of taxes, and hence over the long term contributing to a reduction of the deficit, or paying the deficit off completely. So in summary, the idea of borrowing is very similar to borrowing on an individual basis. You want to borrow to finance a road, school, or industrial project that will be used for many years to come. However, borrowing for projects that don't contribute to economic growth, such as borrowing to pay government salaries, or what happens in developing countries, borrowing to fund the presidential motorcade, does not help in reducing the deficit, as these are not items or expenditures that will generate long-term growth, which is vital to reducing a deficit. So how does US debt compare to the rest of the world? Well, what we see is that the US has experienced rising debt. However, this debt does not compare, or is lower than that of Japan, Greece, Italy, Portugal, and also United Kingdom. But it is higher than that of Germany, Korea, Norway, and Chile. So there are other countries which have higher levels of debt, and specifically Greece, Italy, Portugal have experienced crises. So high debt is not a good thing to have in some instances, specifically for countries unable to fund this debt.